Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: Death by Dentist. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Murder Most Foul. Today we're discussing an interesting crime of marriage, divorce, and murder. And the book that brought it to my attention was written by Stephen Epstein, and it's called Extreme Punishment. And so welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
As I let out that this is not a mystery, it's not a murder mystery. A murder did happen. It was a divorce gone bad. And there are a dime a dozen. And the only reason, again, this jumps off the page is because of a murder involved. And even that's not unusual. Wife killing husband, wife. But this one, and I'm not going to tease too much, we'll get into it, makes this entirely fascinating. And as I say to my audience always, you have to get the book, because we're going to do the best we can to cover it. But and again, I'm not falsely buttering you up, Stephen, but the writing is incredible. They always say page turner. It is, because for me, page turner is not only just interesting, gets me going, but the writing draws me to the next page. So even if there's not a big mystery at that particular chapter, I want to keep reading without skipping pages. So I skipped no pages on this book when I read it. So to let my audience a little bit of your bio, I like sort of your classification that this was sort of a midlife crisis kind of change into writing, and you'll tell me what your full background was. But if it was sort of just by chance, good move. Good move. All right, Stephen. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I grew up in New York, went to college and law school at the University of North Carolina, and for the last 35 years, thereabouts, I've been a practicing lawyer in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I do today, and for the last 10 years, mostly family law, and that kind of connects to this case. And in 2017, I decided one day I was bored, and there was a case I was familiar with from Raleigh involving a true crime, and check, no one had really written at least a good book about it. And I challenged myself to see if I could write a book. And 4 books later, here I am. So I had no idea I would succeed in finishing a book, let alone in getting it published. And once it was, I thought I was done until I was doing, meet and greets and book signings, and people would ask me, "What's your next book?" And I looked at them like, "What are you talking about? I've already done a book. I'm done." And they encouraged me to keep on writing. So I decided, maybe I should keep on writing. And I haven't looked back.
Well, we're glad we did. And I'll mention this a couple of times, and certainly where people get the current book, which is everywhere. But you also have one coming out on Sunday. We'll talk a little bit. I will tag that at the end of the podcast. So you are still writing, which is great. Now, the prologue to the book, the first couple of pages is by another lawyer who knew we'll get soon to the cast of characters, but Dan Markel, who is the lawyer who was killed, who was murdered, not killed, he was murdered. And this person, as you start reading it, it's clearly not you, but it's someone who had a relationship and knew Dan. How did you come to this particular case to cover?
In a very circuitous way, and I think there was divine intervention involved. So first of all, my second book was written about a Tallahassee, Florida murder, somewhat well known. It's called Evil at Lake Seminole. And the heroine of that book is a woman named Cheryl Williams, who for 17 years pounded the pavement literally with picket signs about her missing son, who had been missing for 17 years, supposedly drowned in a duck hunting accident, and she never believed that. And ultimately, through her persistence, an investigation confirmed that he had actually been murdered 17 years earlier. She got justice, and I wrote about that book, and I became very good friends with Cheryl Williams. And as I was doing the research for that case, alongside the columns on that case were columns in the Tallahassee Democrat on the Dan Markel case, which literally was tried by the same judge in the same courtroom at about the same time. And I just sort of like read a sentence or two of those columns and devoured the columns about the Mike Williams murder case. Well, as I got done with the book and Cheryl's now asking me, what am I writing about next? She started encouraging me to write about the Dan Markel case. And I would say to her, I have spent a year and a half of my life about Tallahassee. Don't want to do any more Tallahassee. I've had enough of Tallahassee. Well, lo and behold, within days of that conversation or those conversations, on my DVR at home is a dateline that records magically. I haven't told it to record a dateline, and it's about the Dan Markel case. It's a 2-hour special on the Dan Markel case. So I watch it, and yes, it is a fascinating case. One of the talking heads on that dateline episode did a podcast called Over My Dead Body, and it was the best-selling podcast pretty much in history. 20 million downloads, 30 million downloads. I went and I listened to that podcast and lo and behold, fell in love with the story. It was a wonderful podcast. I couldn't get enough of the Dan Markel case. And at some point listening to that podcast, I decided that, yes, I was going to write this book.
But so why did you think, gee, I can do this better?
Better is not something I ever try and do. I try and do what I do as well as I can. And there was nothing to compare it to. There'd been no book. And still to this day, there's no other book on the Dan Markel case. I just think book treatment is a different and better way to tell and give peeling back all the layers of the onion. You can't do that even in a 2-hour documentary, even in an 8-part podcast like Over My Dead Body. There's just no way to do that in a very effective way and really get to know the people involved, which is something I try and do in my books, is help my readers get to know the people involved in these stories.
So what did, before we get into the people, so how did you start? I mean, so this was after the case, obviously, because it was on the programs.
There is no after the Dan Markel case. We're 10 plus years in and we're still midstream. So you have to define after in a way that wouldn't work for the Dan Markel case. I don't think there'll ever be an end to the Dan Markel case. Already been 3 trials.
Stuff is still going, but I meant, did you plop in after the first couple of trials, or did you?
I plopped in just before COVID, if I remember right, just before COVID. No, that's not right. I popped in during COVID. So there was another trial that was scheduled. Trial number 1 happened in the fall of 2019. Okay. There was a mistrial as to one of 2 defendants. One was convicted, and the retrial of Haiti Magbanawa was scheduled for 2020. Didn't happen in 2020. Didn't happen in 2021. Finally happened in May of 2022.
That's when you were fully involved.
I was fully involved. I was actually at her trial. Yeah.
Okay. So again, we're going to take it in order just because my brain can't do things other ways. So let's start with the simplest thing is to start with as I said, this is a marriage, and I want the 2 main, obviously the husband and the wife. There are other family members involved. We'll find out how as we go forward. And but let's talk about Dan Markel, who is obviously the husband, and Wendy Adelson. And you can
Adelson, Adelson, hard A.
Okay, Adelson. And you can mix. You don't have in the book again, which is really great. You do focus on what their background was, how they grew up, what they were doing professionally then, and Wendy, and then obviously they met and how that all, and the marriage and the wedding, and I mean, everything, happy days. So give us a little background so we can understand, flesh out Dan and Wendy for us.
Okay, so Dan was a 41-year-old law professor at Florida State. He was a Canadian. He grew up in Canada. He had an older sister, fairly, well-to-do, not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly comfortable lifestyle growing up. always wanted to go to an Ivy League school. He wound up going to Harvard undergrad. He had a fellowship in Israel. He got a PhD at Cambridge in England, came back to go to Harvard Law School, got a prestigious clerkship on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Arizona, and then started a boutique law firm doing criminal law in Washington, D.C., all the while writing law review articles. He was writing law review articles while he was in law school. He was brilliant. And he, by the time he was murdered, had written well over 20 law review articles, a book, and was a scholar that was recognized worldwide in the particular area of punishment. The name of the book, Extreme Punishment, is a play on what Dan's passion was, which was retributive justice, which studied how to get punishment right to make sure the punishment fit the crime. It's ironic in a very bittersweet way that was Dan's passion when he wound up being the victim of a murder. So that was Dan. Wendy grew up in South Florida near Miami in Coral Springs. She was the youngest of 3 children. She had 2 older brothers. Her family was one of dentists. So her dad was a dentist who grew up in New York. Her mom grew up in New York. They moved down to South Florida before they had their first child. Ultimately, her middle brother, Charlie, wound up becoming a dentist and ultimately a periodontist. Her mom worked for the dental practice. It was called the Adelson Institute, and they made a very comfortable life for themselves down in South Florida. Wendy was whip smart, just like Dan. She was valedictorian of her high school class. She wound up going to Brandeis in the Boston area, so they both went to college in the Boston area, although Dan was about 7 years older than Wendy, so they weren't there at the same time, not even when Dan was in law school. And then she, too, got a prestigious fellowship, and she, too, wound up going to Cambridge to get a master's. And then she wound up going to law school just like Dan, although she went to law school at the University of Miami. She was on a full ride pretty much, both in college and law school. She had amazing scholarships because she just kept on doing really, really well in everything that she did. And she was on the dating scene, or trying to be on the dating scene, while she was in law school in the summer between her first year and her second year. And she was on J-date because both Dan and Wendy were Jewish. Dan was much more Jewish than Wendy. This becomes an important part of the story. But Wendy was Jewish. She went to Brandeis, which is one of the most Jewish universities in the country. And she's on J-date looking for a potential match with her mother, Donna, and we're going to talk a lot more about Donna, peering over her shoulder at the men who are coming up on the screen. And eventually, a guy named Dan Markel, who's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., comes up on the screen. And Donna looks at him on the screen, reads his bio, and says, "That's the guy for you, Wendy." And that's how the dating relationship between Wendy and Dan began. It was a long-distance relationship with Dan as a lawyer in D.C., hoping to become a law professor. He hadn't yet. And Wendy as a law student, now starting her second year of law school at the University of Miami.
So now they have met. We can jump forward a little bit. They court, and they work out. Eventually, they work out that they want to get married, that where they're going to live, how they're going to be able to set up to be together. You give us a little of that. It's not as if the point is they do end up living in the same place.
You have to put yourself out there nationally. There are only 200 or so law schools in the country, and there are only about 200 job openings a year for law professors. So even if you have the pedigree that Dan Markel had, you can't pick where you're going to teach law school. So you have to put yourself out there nationally, and it's extremely competitive. There are a lot of very talented young lawyers that are trying to become law professors. So where you end up is anybody's guess, both in terms of geography and the quality of the law school that's going to make you an offer. The best Dan was able to get was Florida State, which wasn't one of the best law schools in the country. It was certainly top third in the country, but it wasn't one of the best law schools. And so that was the best he could get. And it was in an area of the country he knew very little about, Tallahassee, Florida. Tallahassee, for those who are listening who don't know, has much more in common with South Alabama or South Georgia than it does with what most people think of Florida. And it was an eye-opener for a Jewish guy from Canada like Dan Markel, who had only lived in big cities like Boston and New York and Phoenix. It was quite the eye-opener. And for Wendy, She knew very little about Tallahassee, even though she spent her whole life living in Florida, because it's 7.5 hours by car in the Florida Panhandle from where Wendy grew up. So when they both made their first site visit, when Dan was offered a job at Florida State, they were just boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. It was a shock to their system. And the way that Dan sold it to Wendy was, look, I'm going to climb the academic ladder. It's only going to be a year and we'll get the hell out of here and find somewhere better, higher up the food chain of law schools. And she eventually relented and said, okay. And so not only did Dan move from Washington, D.C., Wendy moved from Miami to Tallahassee. They were not married. They were not engaged. And Wendy shifted her legal education from the University of Miami to Florida State, basically on loan from her law school. She was still going to get her degree from the University of Miami in order to make this work. So there had to be a lot of pieces falling in place. And again, Dan, without telling his employer, was telling Wendy, don't worry, we're just going to be here for a year.
So it starts out pretty good. I mean, they settle, they buy a house, they have children. I'm not sure if both came when things were good or one was at the rollout, or I mean, at the ending part of the marriage. But they had two kids, two lovely kids, and they had, again, as you mentioned, that Dan was from Canada, so his parents were still there, correct? Like in Toronto.
They actually split their time between Canada and, ironically, South Florida, as a lot of Canadians do. They call them snowbirds, right?
So the families, it wasn't too hard for either, and nor for Wendy's parents, but so let's start filling out a few of the other cast of characters. We've talked a little bit about we mentioned Charlie quickly, so we want to cover obviously Donna, who is the we can say overbearing mother, Charlie, who is the brother of Wendy, and that's sort of the conflagration, if you will, that puts together this, why we're even here about a murder case. So I'm sure you can fill in a little bit about our other cast members.
Sure. So Wendy's family turns out to be much more important to the story than Dan's family. And Wendy, as I said, is the youngest of three kids. Her oldest brother, Rob, is really not in any way connected to this story. I explain a little bit about him because what happened to him in terms of the way his mother and his father disowned him for a period of his life is kind of a precursor to what happened in this story. But we'll put him to the side because he's not directly involved in what happened. Her middle brother, Charlie, is directly involved in what happened. And in fact, today is in prison for the rest of his life. And we'll talk about how he got there. But Charlie was, classic narcissist. Literally drove around in a red Ferrari with the moniker Maestro emblazoned across his vanity plate. Had multiple cars like that, made millions of dollars a year. Don't get me wrong, the guy worked really hard. He had a cottage industry of traveling South Florida as a traveling periodontist, providing oral surgeries in dental offices where the dentist offices, they didn't have periodontists. And he made bukus of dollars doing that, got very rich, worked 16-hour days because it had him on the road constantly. But he did very well by himself. He also eventually owned the Adelson Institute. In fact, at the time of this murder, he owned the Adelson Institute, bought it from his father, eventually sold it back to his father. He also had construction businesses and did realty. He tried to make money in every way imaginable. He was also a guy who built up his body while he was in college. Some of that was through the use of steroids. He went to the gym, had several friends in the gym community who were, let's just say, from the other side of the tracks. And Charlie just didn't have any real compunction about what the law was and how it applied to him. Long before this murder, he never was in trouble with the law, but it wasn't that he was real compliant with it either, whether it was his penchant for drugs, including marijuana and steroids, or tax evasion and things like that. Charlie did what Charlie wanted to do, and he dared people to try and rat him out or put him away for what he was doing. That's the way he lived his life. He thought he knew best about everything. And he had a lot to say about everything. The guy does not stop talking.
I think we need to point out, you might have been going to get there, that he was a ladies' man. I mean, he had...
Yes, absolutely. So the only child that Charlie Adelson has, who's now somewhere around 7 or 8 years old, was by a nanny, a nanny for Wendy, of all people. Yes, Charlie had girlfriend after girlfriend, and just... it's reputed that he also spent time in Southeast Asia, doing the junket there of young women. He liked his ladies, and he liked to move fast with them, and he kept them from each other. He overlapped his relationships, and the one child he bore was while he was living with another woman. Wasn't that woman's baby. So that's the way Charlie envisioned himself, as a ladies' man, and ran fast in those circles.
And of course, it will as we go forward, it will have, again, a key element in this is a connection between what happened and one of these ladies. So we've got Charlie over there. Like you said, you've described him beautifully. And like I said, it's very, every time you turn a page in the book, I'm saying, oh, come on. Really? Oh, man. What?
He's almost a caricature. It's hard to believe he is what he is.
It is, and there he is, and he can live his life and do what he wants, except. So we now are into, and this is what's not gray area, but it becomes he said, she said when we talk about the divorce. The marriage deteriorates, and I think I'm going to point this out. You please can correct me if I'm wrong. That it's always easy if there's physical abuse, if there's drug abuse, if there's gambling, if there's affairs and stuff, and you can pick then one side over the other. But as I follow this, and a lot of it I'm getting from the briefings and the filings in the case and the eventual divorce case, was even though they beefed him up as time went on, there wasn't an open, and again, Wendy moved for the divorce. There wasn't an open accusation of anything that anyone could hang their hat on. So that makes it, a little bit sad that it was just, it ran out of steam, whatever you want to say. Someone felt neglected. I mean,
So it wasn't. Let me describe what I think it was, and I do in the book. I didn't mention that Wendy herself became a law professor. So after Dan, obviously, because she was still in law school when Dan became a law professor, but eventually she becomes what's called a clinical faculty member at Florida State. And in the world of legal academia, clinicians are the redheaded stepsisters. They make less money. They have offices that often pale in comparison to the offices of the true tenure track, what's called tenure track faculty. So Dan is rising. He's rocketing as a scholar. The articles he's writing are getting a lot of notoriety, and he's well regarded as a law professor in the truest sense of the word. Wendy is on the clinical faculty, which means the students actually do real work under her supervision, and she's in his shadow constantly. Dan is flying all over the country to give lectures, sometimes all over the world, and she's left with the kids. So some of that is just she's being left with the grunt work. He's getting to do the cool stuff. And some of it is she was just as decorated coming out of college and law school pretty much as he was, and he's the one getting all the glory. And then there's the Dan not recognizing her being the significant, he's too busy to recognize what she's doing. She's writing a book. She's written a book. It's out there. And she thinks it's hot stuff. And in fact, Florida State says it's hot stuff. And they assign it to all of the incoming freshmen at Florida State to read. And Wendy's going to be the key speaker at their convocation. And yet Dan is somewhat neglectful from Wendy's vantage point of her and her accomplishments. He didn't even bother to read the book, she says. And she wants out. She does. And then she's getting egged on by Donna. Donna wants her to get out. Donna was the first one saying Dan Markel was the man for her. She was also the first one saying he wasn't the man for her. And so they were conspiring for Wendy to get out of the marriage long before Dan knew that he was living in a bad marriage. In fact, Dan, the day that this all came to pass, had no idea that Wendy was about to do what she did, which was take half of the furniture and possessions from the marital home, move them all to a rental home, take the kids. And when he returned from a trip to New York, he found a half-empty house and no kids. And Wendy had called him in New York to say she was getting divorced, and she left divorce papers on the marital bed.
And you call this, which is great. It comes up, the word comes up several times, the phrase Pearl Harbor.
I didn't call it that. Dan called it that.
I know that, but I mean, it's in the book.
Yes, that's the chapter title.
It's the Pearl Harbor. And again, along with clearing, I can imagine coming home and seeing all the stuff, the kids' stuff gone. There was a mattress on the floor, the crib mattress.
That's correct. The letters of the alphabet ripped off the wall in their room. Yeah.
And she went and took stuff from a safety deposit box.
Yes.
There's the ring thing. We could talk a little bit. That's debatable. But didn't she actually take like cash or something?
She took half, and that's not uncommon. I'm a family law attorney. I advise clients all the time to take half of what there is. And she literally took that to the extreme. Like there were 6 chairs or 8 chairs on the dining room table. She took half of them.
Well, she's a lawyer, so she knows, you know. And again, so he's not in the dark. I mean, obviously, he knew, even if he wasn't paying a lot of attention, this wasn't like, what? He did. Okay,
so the other thing you got to know about Dan was that the oxygen he breathed consisted of the chemical oxygen and a boy named Benjamin and a boy named Lincoln. That was the oxygen that Dan breathed. The day that Wendy pulled this stunt and moved away, it wasn't the furniture, it wasn't this money in the safe deposit box, it wasn't the ring, it was his oxygen, his voice. And that was an existential threat to his very existence. And that's why this became such a bitter, nasty fight, is because she was threatening to take them away, not just away from living with him all the time, but when she proposed moving to South Florida with them, away from him pretty much all the time. And that was about the last thing in the world he was going to allow to happen.
Now, again, it is a progression. And I want to leave this for people to read in the book. I'm sorry, folks, you're going to have to give me the book. That will touch it a little bit, but it did become a tit for tat progression. Lawyers were hired and fired. A lot of Donna was bankrolling, and Dan was doing the best he could with what he had to get the best divorce attorneys. And so it started again. Okay, as I said, Dan was focused on the kids, and every time either side would win something, it got nastier, of course. That's how it goes. And when Dan, I think the biggest thing you mentioned is this, and I know it's something that parents deal with all the time, or divorced parents. It's like, okay, we've got it. I don't like here. I want to move away from here. But if I move, I can't take the kids away from where they are. So it's split custody or whatever. I can move if I want, but then I got to come back and visit. So neither one of them, I don't know, maybe some courts will say, you know, the kid should be with the mother anyway. So if the mother wants to go to Mars, then she calls Elon Musk and she goes. But in this case, we'll cover this one. So it started, again, we don't want to get in the weeds legally, but it started as a mediation, right?
Well, it started with just the simple divorce filing, and then within a few months of the divorce filing, Wendy files this petition to relocate with the boys, and eventually that culminates in a hearing before a judge, and the judge says, no, you're not going to take these boys to South Florida. You would have thought that would have been the end of it, but behind the scenes, you have Donna scheming with Wendy, and we know this from the emails. We're not going to get into the degree of all this horrible stuff that Donna says in the emails, but the long and short of it is that Donna's behind the scenes conspiring with Wendy as how to, even after she lost, to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and that's to bring Dan to his knees, to make him capitulate and relent. There's nothing in those emails about we'll kill him, but bribe him, yes. Dress the boys up in front of a church and have them converted to Catholicism, invite Dan's family to his baptism, and all this horrible stuff. The malevolence, it just oozes out of those emails. And Donna believed that Dan was basically turning her grandchildren into Hasidic type Jews. That they were going to grow up and they were going to braid. They're going to have these long braided hairdos and hats, and that's not what Dan was. But she viewed Dan's version of Judaism as being so extreme that and Dan was trying to raise the boys kosher, And Wendy had agreed to that originally. And then Wendy reneged on that, and Donna made sure that Dan knew that they weren't doing anything of the sort. In fact, a few times they would Skype, which was the technology at the time, and Dan was able to see his boys down in Donna and Harvey's home. Donna made sure they were eating bacon. On screen.
Right. And again, like I said, once it was focused, they know. In other words, you know where where you can hurt your opponent. So Donna knew where to. The money didn't mean this and that. The child support, they battled about that, and who owned the ring, and all this other stuff. But this was again what he was focused on, and it's bad enough again when parents, and I'm sure this is not unique, parents are fighting. And the kids are in the middle, or using the kids as pawns. But then you add for him, in-law, and for her, grandma of the kids. And as I said, it's in the book. The emails are in the book. That it is nasty what Donna did. Now, at the same time, obviously, another family member who maybe from the beginning, you can tell me if I don't remember in the book, was Charlie like sort of okay in the beginning, or did he always sort of, for whatever reason, not like Dan?
There's no indication that he had any particular animosity toward Dan before these things started happening. But Wendy, a very codependent family, particularly between Charlie and Donna. They were entirely enmeshed, but the whole family, other than Rob, we'll put him to the side again, was ridiculously enmeshed with one another and in each other's lives and calling each other. I think Charlie probably called his mother or his mother him 6, 7, 8 times a day. Wendy wasn't as bad as Charlie, but Wendy was part of that, and Wendy and Charlie were a little bit enmeshed, not a lot, but Wendy certainly confided in Charlie a lot when things were going bad with Dan, and that's when Charlie formed his animosity toward Dan, was when Wendy was confiding in him. I mean, a lot of it was just the stuff that Dan said in some of these legal pleadings, and Dan was writing his own legal pleadings, and some of the stuff he was saying was very caustic, and that would get repeated back to Charlie and Donna, and it would just an echo chamber, and that made them mad. So July 18, 2014 was a day that under the custody order that was in place that eventually Dan and Wendy did agree to, Dan had custody, woke up with his boys, got them ready for preschool, drives in his Honda Accord, drops them off at Creative Preschool, and then as part of his summer routine, because he's not teaching, heads to the gym. He's at the gym for about an hour. Walks out of the gym, gets in his Honda Accord, and heads back to his neighborhood, Benton Hills in Tallahassee, drives into his driveway, gets all the way into his garage, and suddenly another car, a Toyota Prius, that's a hybrid. And I could have titled this book Hitmen in a Hybrid, but I chose not to. That would have been a little bit too cute. But a hitman gets out of the vehicle. There's another guy in the vehicle. The guy in the passenger seat gets out, runs up to the passenger side, and before Dan knows what's happening, and he's on the phone, by the way, the hitman puts 2 bullets in his head. Didn't die instantly. He died about 12 hours later at Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. And then they hightail it out of town, and that hybrid goes all the way back to where it came from, which was Miami, which is where these guys were from. And it would take a while for investigators to learn all those details. It took a lot of clever investigative techniques and really good, solid gumshoe police work to figure all those things out. And probably about 2 years before they knew everything that went into those 2 hitmen in the hybrid.
We're going to cover that in the wonderful way that you condensed, because that's, in other words, I did lay this out for myself, for my notes, marriage, divorce, murder, investigation. One of the things, again, I'll point out here to my audience, we're not going to go into the details except just that it did happen. The 911 call is the awfulest thing I've ever read. So I'm teasing the audience, but suffice it to say, next door neighbors, the Geigers,
Jim Geiger,
husband.
And I should tell you that the way that I began my writing of this case, of this story, was in Jim Geiger's living room. So when I made my first trip to Tallahassee, I got my vantage point. He was wearing a mask. I was wearing a mask. This was knee deep into COVID, but he literally gave me a play-by-play from his living room window of what he saw on July 18th, 2014, and put me through the paces of what he did. So that chapter, which is chapter 1 of the book, I'm literally writing this based upon what Jim Geiger lived through that day, which was a day, obviously, that he'll never forget, that his wife will never forget, because, like, how often does that happen, that you walk next door and your neighbor has been shot in the head and killed?
So again, that is something that, and again, because it's right early in the book, if that doesn't catch you, nothing will. So obviously the police, they jump into it. It's a murder. They jump into it right away. And obviously you start, all these crimes, you start in the middle with the family and you work your way out.
They start with Wendy, because Wendy was sitting in police headquarters within a couple of hours of the shooting.
And that interview is also, it's not,
2 chapters of the beginning of the book, because it's such an extensive interview with Wendy. It's not
necessarily done like a transcript, but it's got everything you need. It's not like question answer. Sometimes that gets boring in books. So you have quotations where it's necessary, and you explain, the essence.
Try and explain Wendy's body language. I mean, if you've seen her, she's almost coming out of her body as she's having this interview with Craig Isom. And she says so many things that incriminate her family about how angry they were with Dan. And she's wondering, who could have been angry enough with him to do this? I don't think my family. I don't think my brother. But by the way, my brother did say that he got me this TV as a divorce present because it was cheaper than hiring a hitman. That literally came out of Wendy's mouth within hours of her ex-husband being shot in the head.
And she allowed for a gunpowder residue test, and then she gave over her cell phone, and there was no...
And her vehicle, and her computer.
For a lawyer, right? She didn't do it with a lawyer, at least that interview.
She cooperated for one day, but in that one day, she provided them a lot of access to a lot of stuff.
And I think, again, we can certainly mention it's important to the story. But we can, touch on, again, his name is escaping me now, the boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse.
That's correct. You said it right the first time.
Lacasse. And I'm amused by him because he was sort of at a point in a relationship. His same thing. It was maybe good, and she was pushing him away a little bit, this and that. So obviously he's got not an agenda, but he's got a prejudice, if you will. But in the first interview, I guess it's sort of, he didn't sort of do anything really that damaged her.
So Jeff Lacasse was somebody that actually, a friend of Wendy's, who came to her interview with the police as in a supporting role when Wendy was actually looking for people who might pick up the kids from preschool. Jane McPherson was her name. And so she's actually sitting there for 40 minutes or so of the interview when Wendy's just actually waiting for the investigator to come back. And she's sitting there with the victim advocate, and they're talking. And Wendy asked who could have been mad enough at Dan to do this. And her friend Jane McPherson says, do you think Jeff could have been crazy enough to do this? And that's the first. So a lot of people are mistaken in their belief that Wendy tried to throw Jeff Lacasse under the bus. It was actually her friend who brought him up. Wendy says, no, I don't think so. That doesn't make any sense to me. But because of Jane's insistence, Wendy mentions Jeff Lacasse's name to the investigator, Craig Isom, and they do call him in and they talk to him. And it's very clear that Jeff wasn't involved in this, but it is kind of uncanny because Jeff is almost a dead ringer for Dan Markel. They look very much alike, same kind of wiry frame. It was very interesting how much they looked alike, and a lot of people have commented on that. But Jeff had a relationship with Wendy. He was her most recent boyfriend, and they were boyfriend and girlfriend up until a few days before the murder. And so Jeff has a lot of interesting things to say about Charlie, including that his radar went off right away when he was sitting in a hot tub with Charlie, and Charlie's bragging about the things that he would make his girlfriends do sexually. And he then, in a second interview, spends all of his time talking about how Wendy had done and said all of these things that now that he's looking back on it, made him wonder, could Wendy have been involved in this?
And not necessarily, it was certainly at this time, but as they were questioning various people, again, in the short circle, they're also taking such simple, I mean, it's not Law and Order, in a half hour they solve the case, but as you said, it was a long-term process. But initially, with that little bit of information from Jim Geiger about what the car kind of looked like, he was not 100%. He said, I like color, silver or something. We know the colors can be weird, and that it was maybe a Prius, but so they then do one of the things I thought was most fascinating. The cell phone tower stuff is kind of boring, but the camera stuff,
the bus cameras.
Take us through the first the CCTV, I guess, one, and then the bus camera. Come on, the bus camera.
Yeah, one of the investigators of Tallahassee Police Department came up with this bright idea that we know what Dan's route was that morning. We know he's at the gym. They actually got surveillance footage from Dan coming into the gym, leaving the gym. They saw this silver Prius actually tailing Dan leaving. They actually had that on film. They knew that they had this Prius, but they couldn't get close enough with that footage to see a license plate. So, is there any other footage we might have? And they knew Dan's route because there's only so many ways to get to Premier Gym from Benton Hills. And they knew that there were buses that ran that route. And the buses had cameras, not just that filmed inside, but filmed outside. And sure enough, 2 different buses got that literally, and they could see 2 different people in that vehicle. They knew that this wasn't just one person because they could see a body moving around. They couldn't see it clearly enough to get any face. And they also couldn't see clearly enough to get a license plate. But they had and they saw several unique things about this Prius. It had an aftermarket side mirror. It had a missing tow hook on the front. So they were eventually able to use that. They also saw the Sun Pass transponder. So they knew if it did come from Miami that it would have gone through the tolls. They were able to get the DOT information to actually find where it came from. They got to the rental car agency in Miami, and they got the rental application where these doofus brains actually put their names on the rental car application. Then they eventually found the hotels. They used their own names at the hotels, and they knew who they were. They knew their phone numbers. They got their call histories. And eventually they started doing some work down in Miami to get them to incriminate themselves, and eventually made their first arrest. Sigfredo Garcia is a very important character in this story. He's important, A, because we believe he's the one who actually put 2 bullets in Dan Markel's head, but he's also important because of the woman who was his wife, as he called her, even though they weren't legally married. He was on again, off again for a decade or more with a woman named Katie Magbanawa, who was also from Miami. She emigrated to the U.S. from the Philippines when she was 7, very stunningly attractive. And they had 2 kids together. And Sigfredo Garcia was the one who they were able to track using cell phone technology as being at the gym when Dan was at the gym, and being at and around his house when Dan was killed. And they literally can follow his cell phone all the way up and down the coast as he's coming to and leaving Tallahassee. They know he is the guy, but the telephone number that they see more frequently than any other number in his cell call detail is a woman named Katie Magbanawa. And they knew very, very little about Katie. Well, once they started digging into who Katie was, they finally made the connection, because during a period of time that Katie was off with Sigfredo, Katie was on with a dentist who grew up in the same home as Wendy Adelson because he was her brother, Charlie. That's the connection, that Katie was actually in the middle of a love triangle between a guy who hated Dan Markel and wanted to help his sister out in any way he could, and the guy who put 2 bullets in Dan Markel's head. And that was the connection. That was the big epiphany for the investigators in this case, was that Katie was the go-between between the Adelson family and Charlie in particular, and the hitmen, which turned out to be not only Sigfredo, but his lifelong best friend, Luis Rivera, who also had a rap sheet as long as Sigfredo's. And was also a leader of the Latin Kings North Miami tribe.
That was a side hustle. I just remember that. So when they're starting to put some of the stuff together, and again chronologically, they're zeroing in on him, and they find her. they're starting to surveil. They don't arrest if they have arrested the shooter and the helper yet before the Dolce Vita. And in other words, when they start really zeroing in on trying to work out who paid for what.
They don't arrest anybody before they set up a sting operation because they don't want anybody to know that they're on the verge of making arrests. They have everything they need to arrest Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, but they decide they want to connect the Adelson family and get whatever they can on the Adelson family. So they stage a sting operation in Miami just outside of the condo that Donna and Harvey are living in. They are the caretakers for these two boys now. Wendy, literally 2 days after Dan is shot, Wendy takes these boys and accomplishes what a judge in Tallahassee wouldn't let her do. She relocates to South Florida with the boys. And they set up this sting operation. Wendy is working. Donna is coming out of her condo, her high-rise condo, very elegant. She's wearing a designer shades, a nice shirt, some shorts, and she's bumped by a guy who poses as somebody who is a quote-unquote brother of a guy who's in jail in Broward County. My brother, he's in jail. And that's actually Luis Rivera that he's referring to without saying his name. Well, this guy's an undercover FBI agent. And Donna is being shaken down. Very nice, very polite, but he hands her a piece of paper with the number $5,000 and a telephone number. And the piece of paper is about the 1 year anniversary of Dan Markel's death and shooting. And it's very clear that what he's saying is, we know what you did. Pay us $5,000 to keep quiet about it. And that sets off a chain of events that creates dozens of hours of wiretap phone calls, because by this point, Charlie's phone is wiretapped and Katie McBenowa's phone is wiretapped. And the phone calls between Charlie and his mom, between Charlie and Katie, between Katie and Sigfredo, and back and forth and back and forth. And then they call the undercover agent. Both Charlie and his mom wind up calling the undercover agent to feel him out, see if he really is who he says he is, figure out, is he a cop? And then that actually, one of the very first things that happened is the Dolce Vita meeting between Katie McBenowa and Charlie, where two FBI agents are actually sitting at the next door table, and they've got camera equipment that is discreet and can't be seen and is recording everything they do and say. That turns out to be the investigative home run, but it wasn't originally because the audio was indecipherable.
Yeah, it was so bad that
it was so bad that in trial number one of Katie McBenowa and Sigfredo Garcia, the lead prosecutor, Georgia Kappelman, played about 2 minutes of the recording just to show the jury, we're not hiding this from you. It's not going to be useful to you because you can't understand a thing. So it could have been an investigative home run at that point, and this is in 2016 is when it was done. April of 2016 was when that occurred. The trial was in 2019. It was useless then, but it would become very useful later.
Now, what I also, again, it's in the book, and it's exciting as you're reading it. If you don't know the outcome of everyone that's going to get tried, is that Donna, when it freaks her out, I don't blame her. She has no idea what this is about, that this is just some guy off the street, or she's complicit, or she could guess what it's about. All that stuff, it obviously is possibly out there, but she calls Charlie, go, what the fuck? And he, at first, is like, well, I don't want to talk to you. He doesn't say, I might be tapped. He said, well, I'll talk to you later. Then she goes, okay. Then he waits about a half hour. He wants a little more details. She still doesn't want to do it on the phone. He went, okay, tomorrow. And they
but during one of those conversations, I believe it was actually the very first, he says, who does this involve? Does it involve Wendy? And Donna says no. In fact, she repeats no 7 times. No. Who does it involve? And she says, the two of us, almost under her breath. And he says, what? What did you say? And she says, I think it's both of us. And those are the most incriminating words that have been. Charlie has a bunch of incriminating words at Dolce Vita, which we'll get to. But in terms of Donna, her trial hasn't happened yet. But when it does happen, you can better believe the jury's going to hear those words over and over and over again. When Donna says the both of us, the two of us. So whether, and yes, we'll get to that as we talk about that, because we're coming up on trials, and they're each one is a little. Play in itself, a little Macbeth here, that you're not clear even here, and it will have to come out
as you said, she's going to be tried. Did she know before? Did she just push people, or was she fully involved? There was a payout. Did it all come from him, Charlie, or did she add to it, or whatever?
Well, she signed 44 checks to Katie Magbanawat after the crime. The
question. So, but am I right that at this point, at the time of the bump, and the stuff that comes out of those initial phone calls back and forth, is there any? Do you feel at that point it's clear in the calls as a lawyer? Do you feel that it's clear that she is more than just an accomplice after the fact?
I don't think you can deduce that just from you have to understand all of the circumstances together. You have to understand how Donna was egging Wendy on about the divorce and the evil things she was telling Wendy to do, which, by the way, Wendy didn't do, including trying to bribe Dan with $1 million. So you have to understand the whole picture, and certainly the 44 checks that were paid every 2 weeks to Katie Magbanawat to keep her quiet. All of the gifts that Katie Magbanawat got to keep her quiet. The fact that Katie Magbanawat kept quiet for 6 years in jail before she was finally convicted. Donna was involved in all of those things, and Donna is in many of the wiretap communications. And it's very clear that Donna wanted this problem to go away in the worst way. And Donna wasn't asking questions about what happened and why it happened. Donna, her attitude was, we've got to make this problem go away. The problem being the fact that people think we may have been involved in this murder, and we got to figure out how to deal with it. Although I will say, Donna was the one who said, we're not going to pay the guy who's shaking us down. And she told him that to his face. We're not going to pay you. Go try and find the reward money. But we don't have anything to do with this. I wasn't involved. So go find your money somewhere else.
So ultimately that didn't work. In other words, they didn't press it. I mean, they didn't start getting nasty. The FBI, they didn't use this and push it beyond.
They did said that there were multiple communications, including calls that were made to the Adelson Institute, where the undercover agent tried to speak directly with Harvey. There was a letter that was sent to their home. There was a text that was sent to Donna, and they kept on trying to up the ante. But after the phone call where Donna said, "You're not getting any money from me," they decided they'd gotten all they could from the wiretap stopped, and that's when they made arrests of the hitmen.
Right. So at that point, when they decide we've gotten, what we can get, and we can certainly, even without this probably, because of all the other evidence they have, we can get the hitmen. So they start with them. Now, did they also fold in? Because Katie was tried.
Katie was arrested later.
But the trial that then is going to happen.
So Katie's arrested a few months after. So it's Sigfredo in May. It's Luis Rivera, who's arrested. He's already in prison because he's been sentenced on RICO crimes for being a Latin Kings member. He's already in prison in Orlando. He rolls, and so that's the big break in terms of getting the inside story. He rolls on both Katie and Sigfredo, his lifelong best friend and his lifelong best friend's wife, so to speak, and gives them the whole story. That was a huge breakthrough. They arrest Katie the next day. And
so the trial, again, and the book is great. You get into the pre-trials and the lawyers. Again,
even from there, it took 3 years to get that first trial.
And unfortunately, we don't see these things. They happen quickly. The trial's supposed to happen quickly. What happens, of course, is that Katie's denied bail. And so she sits, as you say, you said 6 years, but it's 2 trials. That her first trial, she's not going to be let out. So she's got to stay there until the trial, and all the delays and everything that's going to happen with a murder trial. So boom, then she has a trial. Then we'll talk about then what happened with that trial. And she ends up having to have another one. She has to wait through that. And then the end of that. So we then have a trial. And again, I do say to my audience, the book is great with the description and the backgrounds of the attorneys involved and some of the horrible stuff that the poor defense attorneys, one or both of them had cancer and, had to have some time off for chemo and that, and then came back. They didn't give up the case. And so we have we're going to call it this is the first trial of, as you said, it's the two hitmen and
well, it's the trial because one of them rolled. So he's actually the prosecution witness.
Right. So I'm sorry. So he's not going to, and he's got a great deal, as you point out in the book, that what he's offered is a deal for whatever crime that he agrees to, or charge, let's put it that way, that they're going to concurrently put that on his other sentence that he's already been serving for the RICO thing.
He gets 7.5 years in addition to the 12.5 years he was already serving.
Like, this is great. So again, the trial is important, and it is amazing insights into it. Now, was this mostly from this was from transcripts on the first trial? Did you
from video as well? It was all they had pool camera and the whole thing. Yeah, it wasn't court TV, but it was videotaped with a pool camera, and I was able to watch 100% of the footage.
So did you sit at home and go through
basically
hours and
hours and hours and hours? Yes.
So
I also have the transcripts, yeah.
But it's great because again in the book you get condensed, but anyone wants to go online and see interviews of Manson in prison or something, they're there on YouTube, so everyone can see that. Did Wendy? I forget. Well, of course
she testified. Yes.
She got immunity. Did she testify at the first trial or only?
She's testified at every trial so far.
And
she gets more and more contentious as a witness in each one.
And she's sitting there looking lovely, as we pointed out. And so it is fun you almost do when I watched just a little bit on a YouTube or something of her testimony. I don't know which trial, but it's like,
Well, you wouldn't know because she wore the exact same outfit in trial number 1 and trial number 2 to mess with the head of anybody trying to figure out, wait, is this the right trial? That tells you a lot about Wendy.
There you go. There's Wendy. And of course, you can see it for yourself, but you very well, summarize that she didn't give anything up.
And there are some things that she just outright didn't tell the truth about.
Well, that's fine too. And what are they going to do? They're not going to, they want, I guess, whatever purpose that they put her on to show her that she's there, and maybe even just that, okay.
She's the relationship witness and helping the jury in each case contextualize what's going on in the marriage and the divorce.
Absolutely.
And they could do that through divorce attorneys. In fact, they called a divorce attorney in the most recent trial. And the reality is the best person that the prosecution has to do that is Wendy. And so they've immunized her to a point so they can use her to tell the story of the Donna emails, of the caustic pleadings that were coming from Dan, and about how this had gotten to the point where the threat was made by Dan that if a judge agrees with me, we're not going to allow Donna to have any further visitation with the boys. And that was the point at which this plan, in my view, was put into motion. The point at which Dan filed a motion which threatened Donna's access to her grandkids. That was taking matters too far.
So again,
that was just a few months before Dan was killed.
And the trial wasn't too long. And by standard of trials, the actual length of the trial,
it was a couple of weeks, if I remember right, maybe 2.5 weeks.
Yeah. And again, like I said, the especially when you're getting into the summations and the opening statements, whatever, of both sides, gives you a really great courtroom. Again, that's based on, I'm sure you realize, I've actually, lawyers aren't boring. Sometimes what we do in court is interesting, and I'm going to let my readers know about that. So now we get to deliberation, which was fascinating. Now, how did you get some of that?
I spoke with two of the jurors that were in opposing camps.
And they gave it up. So explain to my audience just how that went.
Well, there was no dispute in the jury room that they had Sigfredo Garcia dead to rights. They had every type of evidence you could have on Sigfredo other than his own confession. Like, he was there. He didn't live there. They had him with all different types of GPSs being there. They have his name on the hotel stuff. They have his name and his phone number on the rental car. He's rented other cars they'd actually made 2 trips to Tallahassee. He rented the car the first time, and he's dead to rights. And of course, they've got Rivera's testimony as to what he did. So that was easy. For Katie, it was a lot of what Rivera said, because Katie didn't go. She wasn't there. So yes, there were phone calls back and forth between her and Sigfredo, but there's no text where they're planning anything. So they have the phone calls that are very suspicious in terms of when they had occurred in relation to the murder. But most of it is Rivera saying, yeah, she's saying, is the job done? And stuff like that. And that Katie was the one who put us all up to this. And so you could disbelieve what Rivera says, and Rivera is a lifelong criminal. But mostly in the jury room, they believed Rivera. They thought he was a very credible witness. But there was one juror who looked at this in a completely different way than the other 11, and that was, they're going to put Sigfredo Garcia away. They have 2 young children, he and Katie, and it's bad enough that Dan Markel's children are going to grow up without a dad, but she couldn't stomach the notion of the 2 children of Sigfredo Garcia and Katie Magbanua growing up without either parent. And she hung the jury.
So the only thing that, and I was going to go back and look at this afternoon before, and I didn't catch it. So was Charlie's trial was after the second Katie trial, or in between?
So Katie's trial didn't happen until May of 2022 because of all the delays from COVID. They arrested Charlie a month before Katie's trial, only after they cracked the code on the Dolce Vita recording, which they were only able to do because Katie's jury hung, COVID happened, and they had basically a 2.5-year interlude between the mistrial on round 1 and the retrial in round 2. And the prosecutor was so doggedly determined, Georgia Kappelman, to try and figure out a way using technology to get a better enhanced recording of Dolce Vita, that she finally succeeded. She finally found a guy who could and did do it. And when they heard 42 minutes of the enhanced recording of what happened at Dolce Vita, that's when they were finally able to arrest Charlie, because Charlie incriminated the hell out of himself in that conversation with Katie. And this is just a day after the bump with Donna.
Now, was the tape then, the enhanced tape, is that played somewhere? Is that like on the on any of the video that you can now see of the trial?
Oh yeah, if you go to my website, it's there. If you click on investigation for extreme punishment, there's all kinds of aspects of the investigation, and one of them will include Dolce Vita.
So I'll listen to it myself, as I said, but they were able to listen to it in maybe headphones or whatever, and understand they probably could, I'm sure there was a transcript, but they didn't have to depend on the transcript.
Well, so what they eventually had was a closed captioned, essentially YouTube video of the FBI surveillance of that meeting between Katie Magbanua and Charlie. You can decide
what you're hearing.
You can see that you can see them talking to each other and watch the closed captioning and hear the words well enough. Closed captioning helped, but you could hear it well enough. And that's where the transcriptionist the court reporter was able to get the words, and you could hear it well enough to know what they're saying. Mostly Charlie, because he spoke a lot louder, because he throws his voice around the way he does. And he said, why didn't they know it was me? Stuff like that. I think the word that Charlie uses, if you were to look at the index, like in a deposition, you get the index with different words from the deposition. The word that would have the most entries is fucking. That would be, because that's an adjective that precedes almost every noun that Charlie uses in his dialogue. In fact, I have a chapter that is titled, "If you want to fucking arrest me, arrest me."
And so he's arrested, but so they hold off on, prepare obviously for his trial, but they then try Katie a second time. Now, she didn't testify in the first trial.
She testified in both.
At both, and so she testifies, and just take us through her second trial a little bit. Again, both they use the tape.
Her second trial is in some ways a reprise of trial number 1, but in some ways a more tightly focused presentation of evidence. And now they have the use of the Dolce Vita tape. And what is so incriminating to Katie about that Dolce Vita is you hear how badly Charlie is incriminating himself about the Dan Markel murder case. And Katie doesn't do anything other than listen to him and contribute to the conversation. If Katie had nothing to do with Dan Markel's murder, she would have ran. She would have run. And that was the most incriminating thing for Katie, is that they're trying to figure out together who this guy that's shaking down Donna was and what they together are going to do about it. And if Katie had nothing to do with the murder, she would not have participated in any way, shape, or form. She was a much worse witness the second go around than she was the first go around, and the cross-examination of her was much tighter and very focused on Dolce Vita. So they actually used Katie as a medium to get the jury to keep listening to Dolce Vita over and over and over again, because they put it into dozens of cross-examination questions, and it was very effective. And there was no juror this time who was sympathetic to Katie or felt like they needed to protect the children, and it didn't take long for this jury to come back with a guilty verdict. And the other big thing is that the defense had to change their theory of the case, because the theory of the case in trial number 1 was that they've just arrested Katie as a means to get to the Adelsons, that they basically told her, you've got to get out of jail free card, and all you need to do is spill the beans on the Adelson, and that was the only reason they arrested Katie. That wasn't going to work in trial number 2, because Charlie Adelson, for the last 30 days, had been in the Leon County Jail. So they needed another theory, and what they came up with was a horrible theory, was that what really happened here was that Sigfredo Garcia and Charlie Adelson conspired around Katie's back to do this murder, and Katie knew nothing about it. It just fell flat from the first time it was uttered. It made no sense in any way, shape, or form that they would have conspired together to kill. It just didn't make any sense, and the jury didn't believe it for a second.
And so she is convicted this time and goes back now to prison, but she'll make another appearance soon. So let's go to trial number 3. Charlie.
What do you want to know about trial number 3?
Let's talk about Charlie's trial.
Well, Charlie's trial is all about Charlie, because everything's always about Charlie. And so Charlie lawyers up with, white shoe. Unlike, now, I will say that Katie had very good lawyers, but Charlie, with the millions of dollars that he and his family had in the bank, they, got the best. So they got a guy named Dan Rashbaum, who actually was lifelong friends with the Adelson family. And he, wanted to put on a just super defense. And Charlie had spent, it had been a year and a half that Charlie had been sitting in jail, and he studied every word of every wiretap conversation and Dolce Vita, and tried to figure out how it all fit together in a way that made him look innocent. And he came up with a story that Dan Rashbaum peddled for him. And nobody knew what it was going to be, but it was a doozy. And what it was that actually these hitmen went up to Tallahassee to kill Dan Markel on their own when they learned that Katie was dating the dentist, and that the dentist had a lot of money, and that the dentist was mad at Wendy's ex-husband, and they were going to kill him and come back and extort Charlie, and that the shakedown that happened to Donna was actually an extortion upon the extortion. It was double extortion. That was the crazy cockamamie story that Dan Rashbaum, as Charlie's lawyer, put out there in his opening statement, and that literally Charlie Adelson was a victim of this crime, because he was told if he didn't pay up, and that's the only way that money ever got to the hitmen, if he didn't pay up, that he and his family members were going to get killed. And he couldn't say a word. That's why he never told anybody, never told the cops, because if he did, he or his family members would get killed. And so Katie came to him and told him, she was so sorry that this had happened, but he had to pay $333,000, or these hitmen were going to do to him and his family what they just done to Dan. And he believed them. And then he eventually shared the story with his mom, and that's why his mom said on the recording, probably the two of us, because he confided in her about the fact that he was being extorted. And he explained all this during his testimony, because, of course, he took the witness stand. He testified longer than anybody else in the case, and he knew every fact and every detail, like to the minute when everything happened. He was polished, and he was completely unbelievable, because it seemed rehearsed, it seemed concocted, and it made no sense whatsoever. Like, if they wanted his money and were going to kill somebody, why didn't they just go kill him? I mean, it made no sense.
I mean, it's a sort of a twisted version of Occam's razor. the simplest thing is probably true.
That was actually if you didn't know, you hit the nail on the head, because that was one of the very first questions Georgia Kappelman asked Charlie Adelson on cross. Like, do you know about Occam's razor? Do you know what it means? Like, and he said, no, that's not what happened here, because I'm telling the truth.
Because it's sort of the reverse. In other words, the simplest thing is true. That would mean that the most complicated, convoluted thing is not true.
Yeah. He said, I'm telling you the truth. I'm telling you what happened. I know because I was there. The absurdity of the story that he was trying to sell. And then all the things that were said in the Dolce Vita tape that were so inconsistent with this theory, that this demure, I'm so afraid Charlie just opened up his piggy bank to these killers when he's recorded on Dolce Vita saying, some thugs come up to me in my driveway. The authorities are going to find some dead guys with me standing over them with my gun, and they're not going to come down too hard on me for what I've done. That's the Charlie Adelson that everybody knew, not some guy who's going to cower in the corner when his girlfriend comes up to him and says, these guys want your money.
But we're not done yet.
No, we're not. Because Charlie and Donna are so codependent. They talk on jailhouse. They talk on jailhouse calls for 30 plus hours from the time Charlie is convicted until the time Donna is supposed to be boarding an Emirates flight with Harvey on a one-way ticket to Vietnam. And the authorities catch wind of this because of all the talking that Charlie and Donna do unrecorded. The first thing they tell you when you're on a call with somebody in jail is this call is being recorded by the jail recording system. Anything you say is being recorded. They don't care. They're just talking about what Donna plans to do, and she plans to get help, fly away, and leave all this behind her.
And again, poor Harvey's being dragged along, right? He's going with her. I mean, at that point, we'll see when her trial's coming up in 2025. I mean, later this year. I have no belief that he knew anything about it, but he's obviously not stupid. So as time goes on, these people are being convicted. He's still with Donna. And
he's Donna when the FBI and Pat Sanford, who's been the lead FBI agent from day one, says, Donna Adelson, you're under arrest for the murder of Dan Markel. And their, local law enforcement is cuffing her, and Harvey's standing there says, no, please don't do this. They're literally on the jetway to board their flight deep into the Miami International Airport. I believe we got to get Guinness on this. I believe this is the longest perp walk in human history, because Donna is marched out of the entire length of the Miami International Airport. And there's literally body cam footage showing this. You can watch this on YouTube as well. It goes on for about 10 minutes before she finally exits the airport and gets into a waiting patrol car. Harvey is left he's a jilted Vietnam traveler because he's standing there at the gate. His bride for 30 plus years is being escorted by law enforcement in cuffs to a waiting patrol car, and he's jilted. He's waiting there like, what do I do now? Has to get an Uber to get back home. His luggage is who knows where.
So the sort of the final opinion, I always let my guests then wrap up with whatever they want to add. But let me ask one last thing that's more of opinionated, Mr. Attorney. What do you think Wendy's involvement was?
I've been asked that question a lot of times, and it's not one that I don't have a view that is consistent with a lot of people. So I'm very gun shy about sharing my views, other than to say, there's a lot of information that we don't know that now is available to law enforcement, including stuff that was seized from Donna after her arrest, was seized from Harvey after Donna's arrest. I have no idea what's in there. Was Wendy complicit in this crime? Stay tuned. We're going to know. And a lot of people believe that if Donna is convicted, Wendy would be the most likely next defendant to face trial and be arrested. But that assumes that the prosecution team meets its standard to have a grand jury consider whether she's involved. And that is, do they believe that there is proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt that will convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? And I think it is fair to say that whatever evidence exists against Donna and Charlie, there is much less evidence that they have at their disposal regarding Wendy. And also, they have another problem, which is that Wendy's testimony in each of these three trials, and it'll be four if Donna is tried, has been immunized. So they have to jump through a lot of procedural hurdles to even be able to use evidence against Wendy to prove that it didn't come from anything she testified to in the prior trials. So there are a lot of obstacles if they do decide to indict Wendy. Is it possible? It certainly is possible that could happen. But I think everybody believes Donna has to be convicted first, and that would be the next likely step.
Well, the magic word, of course, fruit from the poisonous tree.
Correct.
But so I guess that I'm now just realizing that she was immunized, that nothing she said could be used against her.
And it's derivative as well. So she got both use immunity and derivative use immunity. So anything that was derived from anything that she said also would be the fruit of the poisonous tree.
It wasn't like a parole or a pardon where, guess what? You could, if you confess I did it, we can try you.
Correct. She had what's called limited immunity, not complete immunity.
Okay. So this has been fantastic. I want you to pitch your next book, which is coming out on Sunday this week.
Deadly Heist.
You would like to say, Steve?
Okay, so Deadly Heist is about a completely different type of crime that occurred a very long time ago. Father's Day 1991 in Denver, Colorado, a morning when everybody should have been getting ready to celebrate Father's Day with their dads. A bank called the United Bank of Denver, which at the time was the largest bank in all of Colorado, had people working in the bowels of the bank underground, including 4 security guards and 6 tellers who were counting money that had been delivered that morning. All 4 of those security guards were slaughtered that morning in a robbery that led to a police officer of 25 years who was retired and who himself had been a security guard at United Bank as recently as the prior August, being charged with this crime and being tried in what most people in Colorado call their trial of the century. This actually was one of the very first trials covered on court TV. Some incredibly colorful attorneys and judge involved in this trial. And he was facing the death penalty and charged with killing 4 of his fellow citizens that for 25 years he protected as a member of the Denver Police Department. It's a fascinating, fascinating case. And I'm really excited about this book. And it's very different than the Dan Markel case.
So give us your not your email. Well, it's on there. That's how I got you. But tell my fans here your website.
My website is stephenbepstein.com, and on both Blue Sky and X, at Stephen B. Author.
What's next?
What's next is I've got so it's funny. I had to remember that this was a podcast about the Dan Markel case because I have 2 more podcasts this week about Deadly Heist. So I got to keep my story straight, which is getting harder and harder with each passing book.
Yeah, no, I've got 2 this. It is hard. I've got 2 this week, and I kept thinking of, well, I don't have that. No, that's for Friday. I don't have to know that now. Or so, no, you did that a week ago. Now you got to edit it. No.
But I mean, so this is true with my cases as well. There's only so much room in a human brain, right? So as new stuff comes into the brain, old stuff gets squeezed out. So this is getting harder and harder to do because remembering the chronology, the facts, the people, I'm very likely to talk about a character from one book who was actually involved in a different book.
But I can guarantee you can tell me the very first phone number with area code that you had as a kid, but you can't get that out of your brain to have room to put something else in, can you?
That's correct. You're right about that.
Yes. Extreme Punishment is fantastic. You need to pick it up because there's so much we have not. There's layers and texture to this that I can't cover. So again, pick up the book, and I want to once again thank him for his time today, Stephen B. Epstein.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a true joy. Really appreciate it.
So I'd like to thank you folks for kindly tuning in for another episode of Murder Most Foul. If you liked what you heard, I hope you'll tell your friends. Information about the podcast and an email link that can get a message to me can be found at the podcast's website, the address being www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces, .com. So, until we meet again, stay safe, and for God's sakes, don't murder anyone.